these seem to be the non-negotiables about the idea of the Sabbath, that it is a separate day. It's different from the other 6. And of course, because God rested on that day, we are talking about eternity, and there is a perpetuity to the 7th day, which doesn't apply to the other 6. Now, it's not that 6 days of work are not honourable. They clearly are most honourable. But the 7th is honourable in a different way. It's honourable not as a day of work, but as a day of rest. And God blessed it and sanctified for that purpose. And if I might suggest at this stage, I'm not going to follow it just now, but if I might suggest that when God did this, he had in mind others than himself. Because this is something that was woven into the fabric of the creation itself. And it's as if God is anticipating the needs of the created order and the needs of humanity in establishing this separate day of the week, this holy day. So, those seem to me to be the basic ingredients, the things we have to think about in trying to understand how the Sabbath came into being. God's cessation from work, his contemplation of his works, and his consecration of that day. And so, in summary, we can say this: the Sabbath came into existence because God ordained it. God ordained it. The definition of an ordinance is that it has been appointed by God. And God appointed the Sabbath in a very definite and emphatic way. It's one of 3 creation ordinances. Beside the Sabbath, you have work and marriage, all set in place from the beginning by God. And so the Sabbath is a permanent feature of the created order, just as marriage, just as work, so the Lord's Day. And the fact that God ordained it gives it that essential and fundamental character. You can't say that it's a kind of optional thing, something that you can discuss and debate about. The fact that it's an ordinance, that God ordained it, that God appointed it, gives it an essential and fundamental character, especially since it was there at the beginning of creation. And therefore we ask ourselves the question we were asking last week: why is it the subject of debate and discussion and controversy in the church if in fact God ordained it? Why should there be any uncertainty among Christians about what the Sabbath is and what God's expectation of us is in reference to it? So the conclusion we arrive at is that the Sabbath came to be because God ordained it. And not only did he ordain it, but he exemplified it. He set the example. He tells us from what he did exactly what the Sabbath is, as we've seen. He instituted it by an act of resting from his works. No word was spoken, but an action was performed. And later that was formulated into the edict of the 4th commandment. Now we know that God did this for himself, and we don't fully understand why. Scripture doesn't let us into those secrets. Those belong to the hidden will of God. But his rest was an example, is an example. And that's how the commandment rationalizes itself, if you like. It says that we should desist from work on the Sabbath day because he rested on the Sabbath from all the work that he had done. And so the whole thing depends upon the example of God himself. And we have to ask ourselves when we read these things, because they're as plain as a pikestaff in the text, Why are they there? Why did God say this? Is the record only descriptive, or is it in any sense prescriptive? Is there any kind of obligation coming to us out of these statements? Why are we told that God rested? What's the significance of his example? Was it recorded for our learning or just for our information? Those are different things. So the Sabbath came about, if you like, because God exemplified it to us. And the Sabbath came about because God actually reflected on his work. That's something else we are told about. And bearing in mind that that came to be translated into a law, we ask the same question. Well, why are we told that God saw, and that God rested, and that God was refreshed, and that he saw everything was very good? Why are we told those things? Are those things told us for a teaching purpose, or just because they happen to be mildly interesting? And what would be the importance of that teaching if it is there? If we assume that these things were written for our learning, then what are we meant to learn from them? Well, one thing we are clearly meant to learn is that God blessed and sanctified that seventh day as a day of rest. So let me just wrap up this first point. In looking at the Genesis account, we can see that God acted in his own interest and for his own glory first and foremost. But that in doing that, he also established a principle, the principle of Sabbath rest. He also set us an example. And I've asked the question, why is that example in Scripture? In fact, that example establishes a norm. And that norm, that standard, if you like, is that without the Sabbath, life cannot be lived in a way that's pleasing to God, simply because God ordained it that way. And that if it's a norm, of course, it's not open to question, to discussion, to debate, especially among Christians who say they believe the Bible. It's not an open question. As a creation ordinance, it transcends time, it transcends culture. Because God observed it, God ordained it, and God sanctified it. So, where does debate come in? So that's my first point then. The ordinance. Now let's look at the law. I don't intend to be deep and complicated about this. What does the law say? Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you, or your son, your daughter, your male servant, your female servant, your livestock, or your sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Now, so the law of Moses codified and formalized the account of the Sabbath as we find it in Genesis 2, 1-3. And it codifies it in the form of an obligation. Well, it's a three-part obligation with a rationale attached. So there are four things to think about. The first obligation is that we should remember. Remember. We are to remember the Sabbath. In other words, there is a discipline involved. I suspect that it's a discipline that only committed God lovers will indulge in these days, but there is a discipline involved. We are called upon to remember that day, to remember its institution, to remember where it comes from, and then, of course, to to remember its meaning and its purpose and its practice. All of those things. So it's absolutely basic, isn't it? But what we are saying is that we can only keep the Sabbath day holy. If you think that that is an obligation that we should accept, you can only keep that day holy if you remember it. You cannot keep it holy if you forget it. Not rocket science. Also, we are to remember what the day is for. Not simply remember the day, as if to set it on one side and say, well, that's different. We are to remember what to do with that day. We are to keep it holy. We are to distinguish it. Thomas Watson says, we are to regard it as the best day of the week. It's not that the other days are not good days. Well, we get good and bad days, of course. But you know what he means, that there is an honor to working, there is an honor to earning your bread. But this is the best of all days, he said. And if it's the best, if it really is the best, of course, well, you're not going to forget it, are you? It's like what I said about delighting in the Sabbath. If you delight in the Lord, you will delight in the Sabbath. And if it's the best of days, you will certainly remember it. So that it's not marginal to your life. It's not peripheral. It's not something that you think about occasionally, but it's something that on Monday you start thinking about and building up to Sunday. But we've made a leap here to the New Testament, of course, but I won't go there just now. But you know what I mean. It's something to anticipate. It's something to get excited about. It's something to feel a thrill about. And it's a collective thrill. I know I keep going on about this. But you see, that's so prominent in Scripture. That on the Lord's day, all the people of God are remembering it. And all the people of God are anticipating it. And all the people of God are delighting in it. Because all the people of God delight in the Lord. So that's the first thing, remember. The second is keep it holy, to sanctify it, to actually keep it distinct and separate from other days. And so we remember it, firstly, with the intention of keeping it holy. That's the purpose. We remember it in order to keep it holy. That's the purpose clause. But there's a consequence clause too. We remember it so that it will be holy. In fact, that by remembering it, we actually do keep it holy. The result of our remembering the Sabbath day is that it's different from all the other days. It's incomparable.